Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of March. Today we're yet again looking at advances on the Velika Novosylka sector. We'll also discuss movement in Shevchenko, if you recall the Ukrainians counterattack there, and now we have some movement back with a pendulum swing. We're also going to look at the Russian counterattacks in Toretsk, along with movement in Luhansk and another wave of Ukrainian attacks in Belgorod, along with an update from Kursk. So today's frontline summary is jam-packed with a lot of updates. Let's begin by looking at the Velika Novosilka sector. As you can see over here, Russian forces were able to capture another 1.2 square kilometers of territory along the usual route, the area that's experienced the heaviest fighting over the past couple of weeks. You can see the Russians have been trying for a while now to infiltrate into Privilne and from there into Vilna Pole, but you have the 17th National Guard Brigade. They're located around here. They are involved in incessantly shelling any grouping of Russian forces that pops out of local dugouts or trenches that were actually constructed by the Ukrainian side. We talked about a video about that yesterday. March 19th over here, you can see that they utilized cluster munitions to shell a tree line through which there was a Russian vehicle advancing, along with several soldiers advancing along that same forested area. And yet again, the Russians are beginning to approach, inching closer and closer to this populated area. And it is important for the Ukrainians to invest a lot of resources into defense over here along this frontline position, because after this point, looking horizontally, you have an area spanning 6.5 to 7 kilometers westwards that is open. You don't see any solid fortifications over here because it is sandwiched in between two horizontal facing defenses. You can see one that is basically on the border between Dnipro and Donetsk over here. We've talked about this numerous times, but all in all, it expands and connects all the way into Zaporozhye and acts as a sort of secondary or tertiary line before you reach the line of contact itself. And then you also have the other trench line that is closer to the front line. It's basically like 10 kilometers and in some cases as close as 5 kilometers away from Russian forces. And it also encircles the southern perimeter of Huliepoli. So you have this large section in between that has not really been completed by the Ukrainian side. And I've warned about this for months, and I've increased the tempo of my criticism about the lack of completion of a lot of these fortifications, specifically in Velika Novosilka. You can see the contrast between the density and the way in which the various obstacles, including Dragon's Teeth, anti-tank ditches, and trenches, dugouts, were connected together in areas that are located further west from Huliapoli all the way to the north. And these are areas that are, of course, important to retain under the control of the Ukrainians, but they're also areas that have very low troop concentrations and very little indication of Russian movement. An area like Velika Novosilka was always more active and could have been, a powder keg, and now it is because of the entire situation in Vuhledar, and which was always tenuous for the Ukrainians. So had they had more forethought, they would have invested the bulk of their resources into first completing the two trench lines and potentially even a tertiary one a bit to the north that would span the entirety of the Velika Novosilka sector. And that would be from the border basically with Dnipro and Donetsk, crossing over the Mokryali River, and then also including the eastern bank and the fields located to the east, because you can see how the fields over here and all of the villages connected by local roads are really exposed, and there was no possibility for the Ukrainians, in the event of a sizable Russian breakthrough, which eventually occurred, to hold out and stabilize a new front line. And so, of course, the past is in the past now, but the consequence is that now the Russians have been able to infiltrate from this southeastern direction into the buffer zone in between the two trenches built by the Ukrainians that were supposed to defend frontal assaults coming in from the south directly northwards. And so now a lot of the most significant damage that could be yielded by these sort of defenses is actually being nullified because the Russians are undermining them from the eastern flank, whereas the Ukrainians designed them with the hope of repelling Russian attacks from the south, pushing up northwards. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's also why the Ukrainians are defending here in Vilna Pole, because after that point, there really aren't any other positions left before you see a flanking of other villages like Novopil, Zenalapole, and then you eventually reach the border between these three oblasts. So that's just a bit of a tangent regarding the Ukrainian fortification work in the Velika Novosilka region. And I've also talked for months about how there was a lack of, investment in the Ukrainian order of battle in that location, and eventually they came back to bite them. But in any case, let's look at the Shevchenko region. We could see that the Ukrainians, for a couple of weeks during February, they were involved in intense counterattacks, Kotlina being one. And actually, in Kotlina, we've seen an inundation of videos come out over the past few days, and all of the shelling from the Ukrainian side is occurring basically in the southern parts of the town, either along this T0406 road or fields, tree lines south of it, which shows that a good concentration of Russian forces is over there and not necessarily further northwards. The furthest north I've seen Russians located in recent days has been in this industrial zone. And it's basically at this point over here where my map was previously. So I don't really feel the need to add a geolocation as there wasn't an advance. But this is a good indication to us that the Russians remain in control of the current line of contact that you see I have marked over here with this red perimeter, indicating that the Ukrainians were able to get control over the perimeter of the town, but were unable to infiltrate and have just sort of settled for this new status quo wherein, yes, the Russians are in control of the basements and of the more favorable positions as a result, but at the very least, the Ukrainians can remain on the edges and thereby prevent any deeper Russian exploitations to cut off the western flank of Pokrovsk and the E50 highway, which was ultimately their, sort of minimalist goal when launching these attacks. Now, when you look at Shevchenko, the Ukrainians really hoped that this would be a sort of catalyst for deeper advances that would eventually lead to the collapse of the entire Russian salient that's located to the southwest of Pokrovsk. But now you can see that this plan has been put down in its infancy, because initially the vector through which the Ukrainians hoped to achieve this was through Pischane, and it's possible the Ukrainians did not commit all their resources into doing so because they first wanted to see the results with Pischane as a pilot and then with Shevchenko. And so it's not that the Ukrainians have exhausted all their offensive capacity and resources yet, but it just goes to show that even in isolated examples of Ukrainian offensive pushes, they are able to achieve momentary success on a small level and take over the entirety of a small or medium sized town. But then after that point, consolidating and capitalizing on those gains to push even deeper is something that we didn't see over here. And from a Ukrainian perspective, they would actually have the perfect opportunity to do so because of the difficulties with the Russian supply lines in this region, because there are not a lot of good paved roads crossing over the Solona River to reach areas like Vovkove, Pischane, Shevchenko, etc. And Ukrainian drone crews are very active on a daily basis, pushing from either the western or eastern flanks of the salient and having complete coverage over this region. And also, just due to the lack of Russian emphasis on additional advances following Ukrainian stabilization measures, as a lot of units were deployed elsewhere or were just involved in operational pauses. So the Ukrainians had this sort of brief window of opportunity in February to actually, continue to capitalize on those advances. And the fact that even with the positive circumstances that they had, the best one being the fact that Pokrovsk is nearby, meaning that they have this really good, organization point and command and control center. Whereas the Russians, their nearest equivalent sort of center would be in Selidove, which is like 12 kilometers, 13 kilometers away. And then when you look at Kotline, it's about 22 kilometers away. So you can see there's a huge disparity when it comes to the local urban centers that each side can draw from. And Pokrovsk is obviously larger, has much better positions and surface area than Selidove, but that's neither here nor there. So even with those positive circumstances, the Ukrainians were unable to solidify control over a large portion of territory that would actually be able to change the broader tactical situation. But on a local level, they were able to at the very least stabilize the front line. But any hopes of pushing deeper for now have been put to rest because the efforts and endeavors in Shevchenko have been reversed, as I was saying. This came out a couple of days ago, but now we have additional proof because we have this video over here. You can see it's from March 19th of 6 Ukrainian soldiers getting ambushed as they were located in the northwest corner of Shevchenko. They were targeted by small arms fire by the Russian side, which is the indication for us that there actually are Russian soldiers present over here. And more generally, I'm being very conservative because some Russian sources claim that the entirety of the town has been taken back, but at the very least, 2.4 square kilometers have. And there's a potential that the Ukrainians are still using this highway route over here, extending south of Pokrovsk, to operate in the northeastern sections of Shevchenko. But again, when it comes to the worry that it would be completely lost now, that's not true. The Russians have been able to reestablish themselves largely led by the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade. Besides that point, I want to look at Toretsk. This is actually one of the most interesting parts of today's video because we're seeing the Russians beginning to change the tide and the momentum in the Toretsk region in an area that previously they were sort of more so on a defensive footing in. So this is in large part due to the Ukrainians exhausting their own offensive capacity and the Russians rotating their units, introducing units from the 150th Motor Rifle Division to complement and also supplement, replacing eventually the old guard of Russian units that were involved in the assaults over here, which included PMCs and included some DPR units. And some of them are still fighting around here, but to a lesser degree. Now you have mainly the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment involved in defensive activities near Zabalka, and then also extending northwards and taking over areas that are basically on the northern perimeter, running along the northern perimeter of the town, where you do have Ukrainian remnants trying to retain control over the final slivers of land within the urban perimeter of Toretsk. So, due to the high concentration of Ukrainian forces and their active counterattacks that came out of Krimsk, the Russian forces tried to conduct a double maneuver. First of all, they had direct advances conducted, which have yielded success that pushed through the Slag Keep, the industrial zone, and some residential areas, and actually took over a sizable portion of land over the past couple of days, amounting to 1.1 square kilometers. And in total, they were able to advance the Russian forces 1.5 kilometers northwestwards based on this geolocation from the Predator Police Brigade, showing their FPV strikes on two Russian soldiers entering into a dugout. And this is an area that's pretty close to some dachas and ponds. And this also shows us which unit is the most active around here. It's the Predator Police Brigade. They were also involved in another incident I'll get to in a moment. At the same time, though, the Russian forces were able to cross over the canal, the Donbass Canal, in an area that's really been unscathed in relative terms. It's been an area that has not experienced that much shelling and basically zero ground maneuvers ever since the Bakhmut days when Kurdyumivka, Zaranivka was captured. The Russians never made an effort to cross over because it was not really relevant to their overarching goals of Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. And Toretsk, of course, is a bit to the south. So there was never really a need to advance along axis, this axis that amounts to maybe like 13 kilometers of distance along the front line. But now there actually is a utility for it, first of all, because it's becoming outstretched and becoming a liability for the Ukrainians. Obviously, it's a very difficult area to assault head on because you have a huge concentration of Ukrainian trenches built since 2014 and built up even throughout the entire course of the war because of a lack of Russian attention. But the Russians now, they want to use this area. They want to use the western bank of the canal to flank the remaining Ukrainian forces of the police units primarily operating in Dilivka and in Dakhnya and in the remaining outskirts of Krimsk. And they want to attack them from a northern and eastern flank. So you can see over here the advances amounts to 2.75 square kilometers, and there are two geolocations, one of them being older, from March 13th. I just didn't mention it. It's a Ukrainian FPV strikes onto the fortifications west of Zaranivka. And then over here, March 19th, Predator Police Brigade is also involved in the operations here with their own FPV strikes onto an abandoned turtle tank. And I don't even know if you could call it one because the armor itself was made out of cardboard. So, in any case, it was abandoned at some point and then just hit by the Ukrainian side. There was a door that allowed an entrance into the turtle tank, which sort of is counterintuitive because then the drone can enter through there and thereby it was able to hit it directly. And we've seen a lot of armored assets being deployed by the Russian side in this really large region between Druzhba and I suppose Shcherbenivka. But when it comes to just recent days, the focus has been on overrunning the front line, utilizing these armored columns, and in the process also occurring losses in order to penetrate deeper and then dismount forces near populated regions. And so now that's what they're doing by crossing over the canal and pushing westwards, approaching an area like Dakhnya. And you could see how these remaining villages and remaining houses that are a bit more rural in nature are currently in an envelopment state. It's nearly 4 square kilometers that are now in danger. And this will also sort of set up the framework to eventually advance, take over all of these villages that are needed in order to reach Konstantinivka. That's something that the Russians are looking at in the longer term, and that's something that's much broader than Toretsk on its own. Also, over here in the Luhansk region, we've covered this consecutively now. The basically region west of the Zheretz River. We can see over here that the Russians captured 1.2 square kilometers yet again. You could just see the consequences of the river crossing and the continued Russian momentum. But now you can see how there is a solid line along this west bank, and it has a bit of a buffer, as now the river bank buffer zone extends for 2 kilometers. But again, the Russian objectives on a local level will be to reach some of these forested locations and trenches that you see clearly demarcated on the map over here. So that could be another 2 kilometers of an advance. At the same time, though, the most interesting movements from the past 24 hours that you guys are probably looking at will be around Belgorod. And we have two new pieces of footage. The Ukrainian forces renewed the assaults during the night of March 18th, which is interesting because they renewed them in the exact same locations where they were repelled at the beginning of March 18th in the early morning. And I don't really understand the rationale. I suppose just to steelman it, the Ukrainians may be thinking that they were able to achieve some sort of local gains over there and just sort of set the framework and the groundwork for an additional advance. They probably thought that they paved the way by advancing and preventing any sort of Russian physical presence near the border, near villages like Demidovka and Prisele and Lipsy. But the issue is, by the time that the Russians knew the Ukrainians were moving in elements of two brigades and launching armored assaults with engineering equipment, it became obvious to them that they had to move in whatever resources they had nearby and scrape them, deploy them along this line. And now they're going to remain here for as long as the Ukrainians continue to exert any sort of offensive pressure. And so they've sort of been found out. They no longer have the element of surprise. And nonetheless, they're still attacking in the same regions. And it's really a small area that extends from Demidovka to Grafovka and then to Lipsy in the south, basically running along a 10-kilometer area. And this is weird because there are so many other locations along the front line in Belgorod that could be potential targets if the Ukrainians are already within this mindset of stretching out Russian forces and distracting them by attacking in numerous random locations. But instead, they're concentrating it in one area, and the Ukrainians simply don't have the ability to, attack with an offensive mindset and then try to play this numbers game with the Russian side and the northern group of forces, which is already outnumbering them significantly in the Sumy region and could pull out excess forces that were involved in the solidification of the Kursk Oblast and just deploy them over here to repel offensives yet again. So I don't understand it. I explained why, and you could see over here that on March 19th, you had Bars 25, which is just, again, one of these volunteer battalions, and they were probably excess, which is why they were deployed to this region. They shelled a Ukrainian vehicle that was able to cross pretty close to the border, and then also two Ukrainian soldiers that were trying to reach the village of Prilese, and they weren't even able to do that, even though it is so close to the border. And that really goes to show how, even though there was a certain element of surprise, the movement is just so minuscule. We're talking about a couple hundred meters because it's so dangerous to even approach the border, let alone cross it, due to the coverage of K-52 attack helicopters and Lancet drones, Vandal FPV drones, which are fiber optics, and a whole host of firepower means. And Demidovka, this is the area where we have the most notable Ukrainian advance because they captured territory amounting to 1.6 square kilometers. And you could see over here that in recent hours, March 19th, a video came out of the Russian side shelling 30 Ukrainians, and they were split up. They weren't together, all 30 of them, but they were in small groups trying to advance along the tree lines because you can see them over here naturally seeping their way into Demidovka. And as a result, we can say that the Ukrainians advanced another 500 meters, meaning that now their distance from the first houses is like 750 meters away. And you can see the pace over here is very slow. And in the process, they're getting spotted by the Russians and targeted accordingly, which of course has led to casualties. But the bigger issue is the vehicular damage because the Ukrainians suffered so many vehicular losses and we don't even know all of them because the Russians still haven't taken over the entirety of the R200 road. But even of what we do know, there are probably upwards of over a thousand vehicles and pieces of equipment that were destroyed or considered lost, so maybe disabled or abandoned as well by the Ukrainian side during the Kursk operation. I think I'll link a list. There's a Google spreadsheet that just sort of goes through the entirety of it, and it's actually more than the Russians, which is also understandable because the Ukrainians, they're the ones who launched the offensive activity. But for the most part, throughout the entire Kursk operation, the Russians were usually the group that was on the offensive. So the fact that the Ukrainians lost more vehicles, it really is a concerning statement. And it's actually different than a lot of other parts of the front line, where usually the Russians are the ones losing more vehicles. And that just sort of speaks to the horrible logistics that the Ukrainians had over here and the ways in which the Russians improvised and were able to take advantage of their means of firepower. So I'll link a spreadsheet that goes over the entirety of Ukraine's losses vehicle-wise in Kursk. But in regards to recent advances, you can see over here that 8.4 square kilometers of territory was captured by the Russian side, and that includes areas west of Melovoy. You could see over here there was an incident recorded by RIA Novosti of 6 Russian soldiers from the 11th VDV Brigade. They were able to advance through this region, this large open swath of fields, 2.6 kilometers westwards. And in the process, they encountered a local Ukrainian stronghold, and there were dugouts in between the trees. The media company claims that there were 30 Ukrainian soldiers involved in the operation, and they were trying to man this area. And once they encountered the 6 Russian soldiers, they dispersed and tried to retreat under drone fire, of course. And then in the process, the Russians took over the stronghold. I just don't know if it was 30 because in the video, I couldn't see that many Ukrainian soldiers, but I did see some of them getting out of their dugouts and running westwards. So this is a part of Ukraine's efforts to just try to drag it out for as long as possible within reason, because once they encounter an offensive Russian force, they do tend to withdraw in these cases, but they can't do it in an area that's too open, or then they can't do it in large groups because then they get spotted and they get targeted by Russian artillery. When it comes to units deployed by the Ukrainian side, we can see over here that the 704th CBRN Protection Regiment is now fighting and trying to target Russian soldiers throughout their advances over here. So they recently released a video from an area just like north of Gwevo of their FPV strikes and shelling of the Russian side. And that's interesting because, there aren't many chemical, biological, I think, radioactive or radiation units, protection units within the Ukrainian army. This may be the only one that I know of. There's on the Russian side a couple of CBRN regiments, the 19th being the most famous because it played a role in fighting during the counteroffensive. But this indicates to us that the Ukrainians were looking for manpower replenishment following the heavy losses of the entire withdrawal debacle for the frontline Ukrainian forces, whether they be from elite units like 47th Brigade or from the 80th. I believe those ones from the elite units, those ones suffered some of the heavier losses. 82nd may have suffered a bit less in comparison, and same thing with 95th because they were withdrawn a bit earlier and they weren't involved in as many pockets sort of surrounding their forces from 3 directions with a very narrow escape routes. But in any case, there definitely is a need for rest for those forces as they try to also stabilize the Sunni situation. And so this is a product of that a CBRN unit, which isn't supposed to really fight on the front lines, they're supposed to deal with very specialized cases. They're just being given ordinary work of a drone crew and then also of infantry. But they're trying to, of course, hold back the attacks. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.